are demonstrating that blind loyalty to Speaker Dade Phelan is more important than upholding their oath of office.
We can expect in the future that more people will be carrying handguns on the streets in places like Los Angeles, Boston, and New York City.
Roughly 40 million firearms with stabilizing braces in circulation. To obtain a special registration,
or policies as before us today to make it harder for law-abiding citizens to obtain firearms.
Types of disputes that would be settled by people yelling at each other, maybe engaging in a fist fight, are being settled with guns.
Breaking news, the Supreme Court will determine this Friday whether or not to consider another significant Second Amendment issue, analyzing the significance of Range versus Garland. We'll be discussing a significant Second Amendment case that the Supreme Court will hold a conference on this Friday. The case in question is called Range versus Garland, and it involves a challenge to federal laws that prohibit individuals with nonviolent felony or misdemeanor convictions from owning, possessing, or acquiring arms. This case is crucial in determining how the Supreme Court's Bruin analysis should be applied in future Second Amendment cases. The importance of the Range case has been heightened, especially in light of recent Supreme Court oral arguments held last week in the case of U.S. versus Rahimi. During these arguments, multiple justices made references to the Range case, indicating their interest in potentially granting review to it.
Since you rewrote the rules of asylum based on the perceived degree of violence in these countries,
are demonstrating that blind loyalty to Speaker Dade Phelan is more important than upholding their oath of office.
this government can protect its own people except for 36 out of every 100,000 for murders.
The Range case originated before the Third Circuit en banc panel. 26 years ago, Brian Range was convicted of concealing some of his income to qualify for food stamps in Pennsylvania. Essentially, he made a false statement on a form for the purpose of obtaining assistance for his family. Despite having no serious criminal issues before or after that one conviction for a Class 1 misdemeanor in Pennsylvania, Mr. Range is barred by the government from ever possessing or acquiring arms due to this single, nonviolent conviction. This case underscores the impact of a single misdemeanor conviction on an individual's Second Amendment rights. The upcoming Supreme Court conference and potential review of the Range case may shape the application of Bruin analysis in future legal considerations surrounding arm ownership and nonviolent convictions. Mr. Range's legal battle seeking Second Amendment rights. Mr. Range initiated this lawsuit in a Pennsylvania district court against the Attorney General and the ATF, aiming for declaratory and injunctive relief against federal laws barring him from possessing arms solely based on a nonviolent misdemeanor committed 26 years ago. The misdemeanor in question arose from a false statement made on a food stamp application. However, the district court ruled in favor of the government on a motion for summary judgment. Unperturbed, Mr. Range appealed to the Third Circuit, where a three-judge panel upheld the lower court's decision. Citing Bruin, the panel held that only law-abiding, responsible citizens under 922 G1 are constitutionally entitled to bear arms. They determined that Mr. Range's nonviolent misdemeanor disqualified him from this class. Undeterred, Mr. Range sought en banc review in the Third Circuit. The en banc panel found 922 G1, as applied to Mr. Range, unconstitutional. They rejected the two-step approach and emphasized that determining who is among the people protected by the Second Amendment requires a closer examination. The government contended that Mr. Range lost his protected status in 1995 due to the misdemeanor, while Mr. Range argued against historical support for such disqualification.
To run enhanced background checks on young people under 21 trying to buy a firearm.
I'm just inspired by the next generation. I think it's a time for a big change.
I want to be clear, this wasn't based on violence. This is based on threats specifically to individuals, on gangs.
We can expect in the future that more people will be carrying handguns on the streets in places like Los Angeles, Boston, and New York City.
The en banc panel concluded that Mr. Range remains among the people protected by the Second Amendment, despite the 1995 conviction. The judgment prevents the government from enforcing 922 G1 against Mr. Range. Faced with this decision, the government's only recourse was to seek Supreme Court review. The Supreme Court recently granted review in the Rahimi case, addressing federal laws prohibiting individuals subject to domestic crime restraining orders from acquiring arms. The government, now in a challenging position, filed for Supreme Court review in the Range case. This case is scheduled for a Supreme Court conference on Friday, November 17th, providing an opportunity for the court to decide whether to grant review during the next term. The hope is that the court will grant review to the Range case, potentially running in parallel with the Rahimi case, shaping the future landscape of Second Amendment jurisprudence.
Year-old adults, guns that are in common use. It bans for everyone.
Roughly 40 million firearms with stabilizing braces in circulation to obtain a special registration.
And yet at Uvalde and in so many other school shootings, we were not willing to protect our children.
Rahimi versus Range, a comparative analysis of Second Amendment challenges. The Rahimi case, also governed by Federal Law 922G8, mirrors the legal landscape explored in Range versus Garland, albeit with arguably worse factual circumstances. This specific section of the law prevents individuals subject to domestic crime restraining orders from possessing arms, ammunition, and acquiring arms. While Rahimi introduces challenging facts for Second Amendment advocates, there's hope that the Supreme Court will grant review to the Range case, which presents more favorable circumstances. The recent oral arguments in the Rahimi case, held last week, saw multiple references to the Range case by several justices. Despite the Range case not yet being distributed for conference or fully reviewed, these references during the Rahimi arguments suggest a keen interest from the Supreme Court in the Range case.
Conventional wisdom was we would never get any Republicans to support gun legislation, period.
Are ones where, in fact, it's most likely that they should be bringing the highest and mandatory minimum.
Details of the law, but folks, listen at home. Here's a quick summary of what this law is doing. It's already allowing.
With only 4 justices needed to grant review, the Range case may indeed receive the attention it deserves. Interestingly, the government's current stance on the matter is advocating for the Supreme Court to grant review to the Range case, but to withhold any action until after the Rahimi case is decided. The government's strategy involves addressing the Range case post-Rahimi, either by directly deciding its fate or remanding it back to the Third Circuit for reconsideration in light of the Rahimi decision. Case will be eagerly anticipated. This unfolding legal situation adds complexity to the ongoing debate over the interpretation and application of Second Amendment rights in the context of nonviolent convictions.
And no one contends otherwise, but what are the limits? Wouldn't it be nice to hear?
It requires agencies to submit a rule to Congress before the rule can take effect. After submission of a rule by the agency,
Or policies as before us today to make it harder for law-abiding citizens to obtain firearms.
In June of 2021, you changed the department's asylum rules so that it could apply to individuals with significant gang violence.
Most apparent here a defense of the Second Amendment, which this most certainly is.
New actions to reduce armed crime. President Biden has announced an executive order aimed at increasing background checks before arms sales, moving the U.S. closer to universal background checks without additional legislation. The order will also increase the effective use of red flag laws, strengthen efforts to hold the arms industry accountable, and accelerate law enforcement efforts to identify and apprehend shooters. Biden is also encouraging the Federal Trade Commission to issue a public report analyzing how arms manufacturers market arms to minors. Biden is traveling to Monterey Park to grieve with the families and community impacted by the mass slaying that claimed 11 lives and injured 9 others in January. Last year, he signed the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, the most significant armed crime reduction legislation enacted in nearly 30 years. Biden has taken more executive action to reduce armed crime than any other president at this point in their presidency.
But for me, and for most of you, here's what it really is. It's an important first step.
Might end up being a message amendment because the President of the United States will almost assuredly veto it.
Types of disputes that would be settled by people yelling at each other, maybe engaging in a fist fight, are being settled with guns.
As many of you out there, either parents, relatives, and/or victims yourself.
The new executive order includes several actions, all of which fall within existing executive authority and outside of the right protected by the Second Amendment. These actions include increasing the number of background checks, improving public awareness, increasing the appropriate use of extreme risk protection orders, and addressing the loss or theft of arms during shipping. The President's executive order outlines several actions to hold the arms industry accountable. It aims to provide the public with more information about federally licensed arms dealers who are violating the law, using the Department of Defense's acquisition of arms to further arm and public safety practices. The President also encourages the Independent Federal Trade Commission to issue a public report analyzing arms manufacturers' marketing strategies to minors and civilians. The order also calls for accelerated federal law enforcement's reporting of ballistics data, requiring all federal law enforcement agencies to issue rigorous requirements for NIBIN data submission. The Bipartisan Safer Communities Act is being implemented to reduce armed crime, with each agency responsible for the law's implementation to report on progress. The order also calls for improved federal support for armed crime survivors, victims' families, first responders, and communities affected by armed crime. The President is directing the Attorney General to help Congress modernize and make permanent the Undetectable Arms Act of 1988, which is set to expire in December 2023. That's all for this video, folks. See you next time.